Welcome to our monthly lecture in the series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. I'm Rachel Stern, Director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized and Banned Art based in New York. We research, discuss, publish and exhibit artists whose life and work were affected by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. With this work, we commemorate their lives and achievements. Today's event is a special treat in more than one way. It celebrates you, our community, because the artist Charlotte Salomon was a suggestion that came from you. Thank you. We welcome those suggestions. And it celebrates an artist whose life was cut tragically short by German National Socialists in 1943, and her powerful output of about 1,000 gouaches painted between 1940 and 1942, which continues to fascinate audiences. On Friday, the animated film Charlotte, produced by Julia Rosenberg, will celebrate its digital release. Please follow us on social media for more information. And today's speaker is one of the first scholars who researched, published, and exhibited Charlotte's work. I'm excited and honored to welcome Monica Bohm-Duchen, who's a London-based writer, lecturer, and exhibition organizer. She was co-curator of Life or Theatre, the work of Charlotte Salomon, shown at the Royal Academy of Arts in London in 1998, and co-edited an anthology of critical essays entitled Charlotte Salomon, Gender, Trauma, Creativity, published by Cornell University Press in 2006. Her book, Art in the Second World War, was published by Lund Humphreys in association with Princeton University Press in 2013-14. Monica Bohm-Duchen is the founding director of Insiders Outsiders, an ongoing celebration of the contribution of refugees from Nazi Europe to British culture and beyond. We put the link in the chat function. I urge you all to check her out and check her work out. It's amazing. Welcome, Monica.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I have to say, it's a wonderful treat, if that's the right word, to be able to kind of revisit Charlotte Salomon, because every time I do so, I am absolutely astounded by the richness and complexity of her work. And I hope you'll end up thinking the same as I do by the end of my talk. So without further ado, I would like to share my screen. To make sure that there we go. Good. So my title, first of all, A Life Before Auschwitz. Rachel's already said, you know, no doubt from the advanced publicity, that she perished tragically young, murdered almost certainly on the day she arrived in Auschwitz in 1943. And the tendency has been, and I think to some extent still tends to be, to see her very much in the dark shadow of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. And it's hardly surprising that that indeed should be the case. But as I hope to demonstrate, there is so much more to her than that. And I suppose, Rachel, you'd agree that that's very much the thrust of your wonderful Fritz Ascher Society project as well. So while I hope to offer you today a sort of broad, overview of her extraordinary life and artistic oeuvre, keep that in mind, that it is as much about a life before Auschwitz as a life in the shadow of the Holocaust. Now, we have a few works that are not related to the great chef d'oeuvre, I might even say. It really is, to my mind, a masterwork, although actually gender-wise, that is absolutely not the right way of putting it. But Life or Theatre is what I'm going to be focusing on. It's that extraordinary body of work that I'm going to be sort of concentrating on for the large part of my talk. But we do have, and I want to start with this work, which is quite haunting, isn't it? But it doesn't, I think, leap out as being something wildly original, wildly different, wildly memorable even. There are then a few works, at first thought lost, many of them more recently discovered. As you can see, this one comes from a small-ish body of work donated to Yad Vashem in Israel, and I will come back to the significance of the name Otterli later on, so just keep that one in mind, which are a reminder of the other work she did both before and perhaps alongside Leben, oder, theater, life or theatre. But it doesn't give too much hint of the extraordinary richness that I've already alluded to. There are a few works, perhaps this one would be a good example, which do hint at something rather more unusual, a work done while still in her native Berlin, which is indeed alluded to, although I won't mention it myself, in the vast, compendium of images and text that is Life or Theatre, Death and the Maiden. But the title, the topic, Death and the Maiden, is so very, very pertinent. It's a kind of dark foreshadowing, if you like, of so many of the preoccupations of life or theatre. Right, I think now, without further ado, but again, just to stress the tendency, in fact, even to see her as a kind of visual counterpart, if you like, of Anne Frank, and I do firmly believe that this is absolutely an oversimplification. She was much older, she was a trained artist. It's an extraordinary work that I'm about to introduce you to. So here it is. Let me give you a sense of its size, first of all. I don't know, I'd be very curious to know how many of you have actually had a chance to see at least some of the, it's hard to know what even to call it, a Singerspiel, a play with music, in the flesh, as it were, in the original. There was, for the very first time ever, in 2019, at the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam, which is the owner of the work since the early 1970s, for the very first time, a chance to view all 800 or thereabouts sheets. But they're not just sheets. This is part of the problem. I'll come back to that in a minute. But to give you an idea of size, they're pretty small. I think in America, you still think in inches. Am I right? But let me give it to you in centimeters as well. They're all on the same size pieces of paper, 32.5 by 25 centimeters, which is approximately 10 by 13 inches. So not large at all, but they pack a punch, as I think you will see. As Rachel's already mentioned, there are hundreds and hundreds of them. It's slightly more complicated than that, and just to kind of explain further, there are over, I'll get the exact sums here, there are about 1,325 extant sheets of paper, images often combined with text. But of those, she selected out and numbered, not always consistently, which complicates things further, about 782. 769 gouache images, all of the same dimensions, plus 13 sheets of paper, which are entirely devoted to painted text, as you will get a taste of later on. What an achievement, what an extraordinary, huge body of work it is. Look at all the question marks. Look at how she designates the work, a play with music. What is it? And I stress this because I think, as I said at the very beginning, the more I engage with it, or when I come back to it, it is absolutely impossible to categorize. There's a performative element, there's certainly a musical element, there's a textual element, there's the still image, there are cinematic references, you name it. It really is extraordinarily rich, a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, if you like, but very much in its own kind of undefinable category. It really can't be categorized. I can only, I think, begin, if you haven't encountered it for yourselves, to give you a sense in this relatively short talk of mine of its scope and complexity and sheer scale, but I will do my best, of course. So here we have what is in effect a cast list, yes? A three-colored play. She, believe it or not, and you again will understand why it's so extraordinary when you see the work on the screen, she produced this entirely in three colors and white and black. And when you look at the richness of the color scheme, you will be quite astonished at that, whether this was due to practical necessity. After all, we're in 1940 to 42 in the south of France, where the shadow of war is very much present and ever encroaching. We'll never know for sure, but it is a technical feat, quite, everything else aside. It is an autobiographical fiction, if you like. And again, I'm hesitating because it is a fictive autobiography. And this question of how much we can assume that it is entirely based on first-hand experience is, I think, very pertinent, particularly when it comes to a controversy that has only reared its head quite recently, which I will come to towards the end of my talk. So the cast list. I haven't really got time to go into minute detail, but basically what she's doing, she's giving fictive names to all her main protagonists who are clearly based on family members and people with whom she had close contact. And nearly all the names have this kind of symbolic, often quite humorous significance. So her grandparents are actually called Grunwald, they're called Knarre, which is a kind of grating noise in the German sort of original. And as we'll see, her relationship, particularly with her maternal grandfather, was far from easy or simple. Dr. Kahn, Salomon becomes Kahn, able, that sort of sense of a kind of defiant, I can do this, perhaps coming into the picture, and so on and so forth. And I won't go right through the list again for lack of time, but you'll get introduced as we go along to the main characters. Notice also how the names are divided into three different colors: the blue for the prelude, as it's called, the main Hauptteil, the main section in red, and then the epilogue in yellow there. By far the largest number of works actually belong to the main section, as we will discover. So who was she? Where was she born? What kind of family was she born into? Born on the 16th of April, 1917, while the World War I, of course, is raging. Her parents had met and indeed married during the war, as you can see here. They'd met while her mother, Franziska, was a wartime nurse, her father, medically trained, a surgeon. And they have a child quite soon after their marriage. And much of the early part of Leben, oder, Theater is indeed engaged with recreating, of course, entirely from imagination, a life before she was born, but also a life before which she came to sort of mature consciousness. So this gives you some sense. This, of course, is alluding to her parents' wedding. And notice the musical reference, again, for lack of time, frustratingly, perhaps I can't go into huge detail, but music is absolutely essential. We know that her mother was a talented musician and her stepmother to be was in fact a very well-known contralto singer. So music was very much part of her family milieu, and it plays a really important sort of symbolic role in one's kind of perception and kind of engaging with the work. And one also needs to add, I think, that to a mid-century or 1930s, mid-20th century audience, I think a lot of the references would be more familiar than they are to us today. But if you even just look here at the words of the tune being alluded to, and these this is text that's actually there accompanying the images. Yes, we twine for the maiden's wreath, the word wreath. And remember, we are, of course, looking at it English translation of the original German, just to complicate things, but the notion of a wreath, of course, does have funereal associations, so love and death already perhaps in close association. Look also how you have several scenes simultaneously in a single small image. Quite a few of these early images are brightly colored. They're almost like vignettes of what seems to be on the surface a fairly happy family life, bourgeois, cultured, assimilated Jewish Berliners. Look, I think you can probably see my cursor here, look with no apparent sense of incongruity or inconsistency, how, like many such German Jewish assimilated families, Christmas was celebrated just as much as the Jewish holidays, possibly with more gusto, dare I say it. So a happy childhood evoked in the first instance. All the things a bourgeois child in Germany in the 1920s might get up to. And then things begin to turn a lot darker. By 1926, her mother is clearly suffering from what is now recognizably depression. Charlotte, as a young girl, clearly wouldn't have known what to call it, but she retreats into herself more and more. And we get a very memorable image like this, which I'm going to come back to, but I also want to just go forward to complicate one's perception of the work even more by reminding you that for many, and certainly in the first part, the prelude of Leben, oder, Theater, the images are superimposed with tracing paper, with text, okay, which, as you can see here, loosely and very rhythmically echoes the composition of the visual image. Now, how on earth do you exhibit these? It's very, very hard indeed. It's one of the challenges of any exhibition. And I will say straight away, and I can give you the link, in fact, I'm going to give you the link later, that the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam has fairly recently created a wonderfully useful website, which not only reproduces every single extant sheet of images and text, but also actually gives you the musical references and others besides. So it's a very, very comprehensive and very, very useful resource. So try and remember as we go along that for the most part, yes, we are talking not just about images, but images with text superimposed in very knowing, yes, artistically knowing sorts of ways. But there you have in English, yes, Franziska, and notice also it's being played out, as it were, like some sort of performance. Charlotte herself, Salomon, doesn't appear, I think, only once as herself. She turns herself, if that's the word, into a third-person narrator, maintaining an often quite ironical detachment from the story. And I think that's also quite important because there's been a tendency over the years to sentimentalize her story. And one of the things that seems to me quite important, and I think you will see that as I go along, is that there is that extraordinary sense of ironic detachment, almost sometimes of sarcasm and a kind of mordant wit that actually is quite remarkable under the circumstances, again, adding to the complexity of the work. So here is Franziska, her mother, regaling her daughter, she's 7, 8 years old, with promises, yes, of a better life to come, of her ascending to heaven and coming back to talk to her little girl. You can perhaps guess, if you don't already know, what is in store. And look at the difference in style. Yeah, from these almost, sort of jewel-like, detailed, quite meticulously crafted works to this kind of raw emotion, rawly expressionist style where the paint, is very much in evidence. This comes into the picture quite literally. Notice again the reiteration of the "we twine for the maiden's wreath," and this sort of sense of revisiting certain visual and indeed musical motifs is another important aspect of the work. Franziska commits suicide. But at the time, the 8-year-old Charlotte is told she died of influenza. Her death is shrouded in lies and secrecy, which in turn is a reminder that this work, done in 1940, could only have been created then after her grandfather revealed all. Okay, in her childhood, she lived in a kind of innocence about the truth of her family and of her mother's death in particular. But look, here she is in 1940, 42, apparently matter of fact. Yes, but it speaks volumes, doesn't it? There's nothing more to be done about the tragedy. And then look at this. And this is accompanied by a text which runs something like, oh, so this is what they call life. And if you ever wanted a more vivid evocation of the kind of despair and emptiness of a young child faced with the bleakness, the harsh realities of bereavement, you don't have to look any further, I think. But it's not all darkness and grief. And at the age of 13, or when she's 13, her father, Albert, remarries, and he remarries a beautiful, charismatic, talented singer. I've already mentioned her name was Paula Lindberg. In real life, there are even recordings to this day of her singing. She had a beautiful, rather mesmerizing sort of voice. And here she is, as you can see, I think Charlotte here as a young adult is still mesmerized by her stepmother, still fascinated by her. And there ensues a very, very complex relationship. She is, of course, resistant. She's jealous. She's also, I think, dare I say it, almost physically attracted by her. There is a strong undertow in this work, and sometimes it comes to the surface, of a strong, well, sexuality, sexual issues, which have often again been underplayed in this rather anodyne or sort of sanitized version of who Charlotte is and what her work is all about. And again, I'll explain a little bit more what I mean about that as we go along. This is where irony comes in. And just remember, I'm just showing you a very, very small number of what I see as important, key images from the work. There are so many more. But one of the things she explores in terms of her new stepmother is the way that she actually often sang in Christian churches or for Christian audiences. And you get this sort of extraordinarily tongue-in-cheek text accompanying this particular one. Yes, people were full of admiration. There was still so much true piety to be found among Christian youth, where in fact, Paula was actually from a Jewish Orthodox family and very much aware of it. So, this kind of, as I say, this ironic, sardonic detachment and commentary is important too. And then the darkness gathers. What is interesting, I think, and important also to be aware of, and it ties in with what I was saying earlier about Charlotte tending to be seen perhaps almost too much in the shadow of the Holocaust, is that numerically speaking, the number of images that directly allude to world events is actually quite small. I'm going to show them because clearly for the purposes of my narrative, I need to show them, but they're very much in the minority, in the very small minority. When they do come though, they're powerful to be sure. Okay, this of course is the day in January 1933 when Adolf Hitler is elected Chancellor of Germany. Look again at the accompanying text. Yes, just at this time, many Jews who with all their often undesirable efficiency are perhaps a pushy and insistent race. Again, I think this is very, very complicated. Is there a kind of, well, certainly I think a very ambivalent relationship that Charlotte Salomon is actually revealing about her own sense of who she is as a German Jewish woman? It's very complicated. And just very briefly, to juxtapose the gouache that I've just shown you with a photograph, first of all, to show how her almost expressionist, as abstracting of a real life scene, which she clearly would have witnessed, is so much more powerful than a grainy black and white photograph. But also look at the way she's actually reversed the shape of the swastika, and one can't be sure, but it's been suggested by Mary Feldsteiner, her first biographer, for one, that she did it quite purposely. Of course, she knew exactly what a swastika looked like. How could she not? But as a kind of almost subversive act, in retrospect, perhaps small but significant. Here's another of the relatively few works which allude to real life events, the boycott of Jewish shops. I'm sure most of you know about in early April 1933, one of the first things that Hitler perpetrated. A kind of bringing to life, again, enacting through words and images of these horrendous landmark events. And then, as she says in her own text, she goes from the general, the outside events, to the way they impact terribly on her own immediate family. This is her father, a well-known Jewish surgeon, like so many others, ousted, yes, from his job. And as you can see, she produces a very, very powerful, literally a kind of erasing, crossing out of his professional existence, if you like, in a composition that incidentally may remind some of you of the great Rembrandt painting, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp. And this is another aspect of the work which needs to come into play, that very, very often she alludes, sometimes indirectly, sometimes quite directly, as here, to other works of art. In other words, she's a very, for all her youth, she's only in her early 20s when she's producing this work, she is a very, very knowing artist, by no means a childlike one. He has to work for the Jewish hospital, the only place where he can work. And so to Paula, the successful singer, as you can see here, there she is in mid-flow, as it were, yes, in a concert, and the Nazis in the audience, get out, time to get out. And just to fill in some of the gaps here, Paula starts performing for the Jüdischer Kulturbund, the Jewish League of Culture, which some of you may know, which was actually approved of by the Nazis as a way of kind of segregating out, sort of ostracizing Jewish intellectuals and artists from the mainstream of German life, which was a kind of refuge for the Jewish population of Germany, but of course also a dangerous place to be in, perhaps giving them a false sense of security ultimately. It's also worth mentioning that unbeknownst to Charlotta, at the time, Paula was very, very busy helping fellow musicians and artists, and indeed, in some cases, trying to smuggle them out of the country. So whereas Charlotta very often shows Paula in a slightly, again, an ambivalent, not entirely complementary life, I think she was a remarkable woman and needs to be remembered in her own right. And amid all this, what is Charlotta trying to do? She leaves school. She's gone to a school that is relatively tolerant, but of course, anti-Semitism begins to rear its ugly head. And at the age of 16, she decides it's time to leave. She has private tuition at home. Her parents, her stepmother, I think, saw herself very much as a parent, tried to persuade her to train to be a fashion designer. And given that Charlotta was actually a rather plain girl with very little, I think, overt or obvious interest in fashion, it seems a rather odd thing to be directing her towards, but it seemed to be perhaps something that she could earn her living by doing. But she, behind their backs, it has to be said, tries twice to enter the Academy of Fine Arts in Berlin. And as you can see from this extraordinary, powerful and telling image, she tries the first time and she doesn't get in. But she persists. She's nothing if not determined. And look at the difference, this kind of triumphant, much more brightly colored image. And here she is, yes, much more prominent here. Notice the brown shirt in both images. She gets in, there is a Jewish quota, she gets in partly, and we actually have evidence for this, because the teachers at the academy thought because she was actually rather mousy and reticent, she wouldn't pose any great threat to German manhood, as they put it, and I'm really quoting there, but also because her father, and again, this is an irony that many of you will be familiar with, her father had actually won an Iron Cross in World War I as a German soldier, and that worked in her favor as well. Notice again the significant use of music, the tune from the Marseillaise. Here she is in the south of France. I haven't got to that yet, but she's creating this work in the south of France. Yes, very pointedly introducing a patriotic French song into the picture here. And then coming to the main section, which is given over almost exclusively to this character here. His real name was Alfred Wolfson. And I have to say on a very personal note that he escaped Berlin and he came to London, and he lived in northwest London, Golders Green, a rather Jewish area near where I live, and in fact became attracted to him a number of singers, both amateur and professional. And I actually had the pleasure and the honor to actually meet at least one of these women. And I say this with a sort of slight smile on my face, because even I think in much older age, he still exercised a tremendously charismatic sort of sexual attraction, to put it again quite bluntly, on those who came into his orbit. So who is he? In Life or Theatre, he's called Amadeus Dabalon. Amadeus, obviously, allusion to Mozart. Dabalon, impecunious would be a word. It's a made-up word, one that doesn't actually exist in German, but this is who he is in this work. Prophet of song, enters to the tune of the Toreador's song, and it's actually quite sardonic. I'm sure you all know that wonderful, rousing tune, but as we'll see, it's not that simple. So he comes, and I must watch the time, he comes with an introduction to Paula, who's supposed to vet him to become a singing teacher for the Kulturbund that I mentioned, and she in fact starts taking singing lessons from him, and they in fact embark on what one might call a flirtatious relationship. And again, that tends to be underplayed in many accounts of the work. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Charlotta falls for him, and the vast majority of work of images in the main section are devoted to these kind of almost obsessively painted likenesses of Amadeus Dabalon, alias Alfred Wolfson, as he pontificates, as he talks at great length, often talks at her. Just look at this and this. There are dozens of pages like this or this. And just to tell you very briefly about him, he's a very interesting character. He had been a soldier in the First World War. He nearly met his death there. He was buried under mounds of dead and dying soldiers, but survived. And he emerges from the First World War, of course, utterly traumatized, but with a very strong, almost sort of Nietzschean conviction that in order to live fully, you have to have descended to the very depths of suffering and indeed near death in order to re-emerge and create. And I'm not, again, for lack of time, I'm not going to translate this, but it gives you this idea that here she is remembering. She's already left Germany by this time, and indeed left Wolfson far behind, but she is remembering almost verbatim exactly what he said to her. It's actually quite extraordinary. Okay, so pages and pages and pages. She's clearly, hugely influenced by him, and yet, as I think, you can see by this and this, she's also, I think, aware that, he was perhaps over pompous. He took himself a little bit too seriously, that maybe he didn't take her quite seriously enough. Did they become lovers? Well, Paula denied, and she survived the war, unlike her stepdaughter, that they ever did. But I wonder, again, where does fact and fiction, what's the relationship between the two? There are a number of very, very frank images like this one here, which suggests that it did indeed have a physical relationship, and it would have certainly been Charlotte's first, and therefore no doubt, absolutely central to who she was as a woman, but also as an artist, because he did encourage her to flex her muscles, artistically speaking. And there's some very, very poignant, as you can see, silent images of these clandestine meetings on benches, of course, no doubt marked for Aryans only. They often had to meet in railway station cafes, because that was the only place where Jews were allowed to sit in cafes. And then a new phase of the horror, again, for an audience like this, I probably don't need to elaborate, but the events that led to Kristallnacht. And we have just a few, but obviously very, very significant, I won't say generic, but they're images that sort of show the bigger picture, if you like. This one I put in, it's rather powerful, as you can see, but also you'll notice the abbreviation, the numbers in the square brackets. And this is a reminder that some of the images, as I mentioned right at the very beginning, were not in fact selected by her to be part of the final work. And this is a whole story in itself, why she excluded some, but they've survived. And I think, it's interesting that quite a few of the ones that were not included are ones like this, which do allude to wider historical events. I can't help wondering, this does look rather like Charlotte herself, always slightly separate from the action. And then again, we cut to the very personal impact that Kristallnacht has on her family. As I'm sure you know, some 30,000 Jewish men were deported, taken to Sachsenhausen, mainly, not far from Berlin, in the wake of Kristallnacht, and her father was one of them. And there's some really searing, again, raw, agonized images like this one here, where the former dignified medical professor is, subjected to physical and psychological humiliation by the guards. It seems that Paula used some of her feminine charms. Did she? Well, again, we'll never know for sure, but she certainly pleaded her husband's cause, and this dark and again rather terrible image alludes to the women trying so hard to get their menfolk out, once more not actually included in the numbered sequence. And then back to an image that certainly was included, some wonderful, again, sort of wordless. Some of the images simply don't need words at all, or indeed musical allusions, this sense of Charlotta looking on stiffly, but with so much unspoken emotion, as her father does indeed return to the household, with Paula being the one who is able to embrace him first. And so it is that, like so many Jewish families who perhaps hitherto had kidded themselves that, you know, things weren't going to get any worse, Hitler was a passing phenomenon, but after Kristallnacht, I think, you know, really the yeah, there was no kidding yourself anymore. And you get some rather amazing images like this one here, which again, I think shows a certain ambivalence to this sort of sense of a kind of desperation, a kind of, yeah, there's a silent observer, i.e. Charlotta feels as if he or she were in a goose pen, everybody debating about where they should go. And indeed there is, in fact, I have it here. Yes, again, notice the way that the text is a visual echo of the image itself. Yes, the different sort of explorations of where they might or might not be allowed to leave for. In Charlotta's case, her parents decide the time has come for her to leave Berlin and go to what at the time seemed to be the safety of the south of France, the beautiful Côte d'Azur, where her maternal grandparents, who I've referred to earlier, had already found sanctuary as early as 1934. So in very, very early 1939, she is told to pack just a small bag, because the pretense that will enable her to leave is that she's just going to visit her grandparents for a short time because they aren't well, they need her. And again, look how incredibly evocative of the, you know, sort of pent up emotion, the open suitcase, the tennis racket, that's a reminder of that pretext as she sits on the bed. And again, some intensely moving images such as this, the moment at which she has to leave her family on the platform. She also leaves Wolfson behind. There are some extraordinary images which I haven't got to show you, where he does meet her secretly and says, "Never forget that I believe in you." And her memory of him and his ideas is entirely crucial. And yes, she goes down to Villefranche in the first instance, very lovely village just outside Nice, some of you may know it, where her parents have found sanctuary with a very remarkable lady to whom Life or Theatre is actually dedicated. Her name is Ottilie Moore. Remember Ottilie in the first slide? That is a descendant of hers. She was an American woman, a rich American woman of partly German ancestry, who had met her parents and indeed Charlotta in Rome some years earlier, and taken a shine to them and said, "Look, if you ever need help, let me know." And she had this beautiful villa in Villefranche, and it was there that in the first instance the grandparents were able to go and where Charlotta joined them. And then we come to the epilogue, the Nachwort. We're in the Mediterranean, and how beautifully she conjures up the hot colors and the warmth and the lush vegetation of that beautiful part of the world. But look once more at the text, the sort of sense of pain and suffering and beauty being so closely allied. At first then, as you can see, perhaps, you know, in this image, things seem much more hopeful. But, you know, if you think about it, we're in early 1939, and all too soon, the Second World War is declared, and we have now the text in French, a reference to the German troops crossing the Rhine, and war being declared September 1939, and it seems that England is also now involved, okay? And what we have in the image itself, as well as that text, is an image that finds expression again and again, particularly towards the end of this work, but also earlier, of her grandmother. An intense image of almost fetal-like suffering, listening in anguish to the news. And history begins to repeat itself, although at the time Charlotta doesn't yet know it. Her grandmother also starts suffering from acute depression. She tries, first of all, to hang herself in the bathroom, and there's an extraordinary, again, raw image of that very moment. And then there's also a whole series of images such as this one, where the granddaughter is trying, with reference to Beethoven, yes, the Ode to Joy, again, music is so important, to rally her failing grandmother, if you like, to wish to live again. It's, as you can see, entirely heartbreaking. And it doesn't work, because what actually happens is that the grandmother, quite soon after, in fact, jumps from the window, just like her daughter before her, and is killed. Even before that, though, after the first suicide attempt, the grandfather, look at him, stern and stiff, the grandfather decides it's time to reveal all. And there's a series of images which show him in this kind of patriarchal, ungiving kind of way, regaling his astounded, horrified granddaughter with the truth of all the suicides in the family. Not just her mother, but actually her mother's sister, in other words, the aunt, who had already drowned herself in a lake in 1913, which actually is an image that appears at the very beginning of Leben, oder, Theater. Two male members of the family, but predominantly it's the women in the family who take that terrible course of action. And unsurprisingly, we see Charlotte trying very hard not to go to pieces. Please don't let me go mad as well. Let me lose control. Events again intervene. May 1940, the end of the Phoney War, the occupation of France, another stage of la guerre, the war is declared. And what is only very briefly alluded to in Life or Theatre, but which is actually rather important, is that she and her grandfather get deported, her grandmother is now dead, to Gurs, which is an internment camp in the French Pyrenees. Some of you may perhaps have come across it, an interesting place in itself where creativity thrived against all the odds, even behind barbed wire. And she alludes to it, she doesn't show it at all, and there are just one or two images, this one and another one, which shows her slumped in the railway carriage, saying that if she has to spend another night with her grandfather, yeah, she'd rather kill herself. They're released. And actually, I'll just go back to this one, because I'm hesitating slightly. As you can see, I'm also aware of time rushing on. But, and I wonder how many of you are aware of this, new material has fairly recently come to light. A letter, it's a painted letter, very much in the style of the writing that I'm showing you today, which apparently was, if you like, censored out by her surviving parents, which is a kind of confession addressed to Alfred Wolfson, not knowing whether he'd survived, admitting that she had actually murdered her grandfather. And as you can see, this is a terrible thing. I really, really hesitate. How does this impact on our perception of who Charlotte Salomon was? What I will say, clearly he was a difficult man. At one point he actually says to her, and it's there in Leben, oder, Theater, oh, why don't you go and kill yourself as well? I mean, he clearly was the most ungiving of human beings. What I've also been hinting at, that there's also, again, a sexual aspect to it. And Griselda Pollock, who some of you may know, has written quite extensively and persuasively on this topic, to suggest that actually one reason she was driven to this most hostile of acts, actually putting poison in an omelette that she was serving to her grandfather, is that he had made sexual overtures to her, which of course was, you know, the very last straw. Hard to take in, hard to talk about. Perhaps we can come to it later. Okay, so coming to an end now, what happens next? She comes back from Gurs. She actually managed to absent herself from her grandfather. She goes to the Cap Ferrat, a small pension, small hotel, and she spends hours and hours barely eating, humming as she created the work that she then calls Leben, oder, Theater. And the work itself ends with pages and pages of, as you can see, this urgently scripted text. Yeah, and this is actually the very last one, and I think it's worth reading out. Yes, So she is defying the urge to kill herself. She is defying that terrible knowledge of all the suicides in her family. She is defying the knowledge, which she must have been fully aware of how events were closing in on her. Yeah. And she says, with dream awakened eyes, she saw all the beauty around her, saw the sea, felt the sun, and knew she had to vanish for a while from the human plane and make every sacrifice in order to create her world anew, out of the depths. And from that came, and this is the last page, where the title of her work is literally inscribed on her skin as she sits there in the beautiful Mediterranean, creating the work. So in a sense, we've come full circle. Now you're probably wondering what happened next. She became friendly and indeed became the lover of a Romanian-born Jewish refugee whom Ottilie Moore had also given sanctuary to, called Alexander Nagler, and they decided to get married. And in a way that was their undoing, because they go to the registry office in Nice and he's actually got false papers hiding the fact that he's Jewish, and he's told that he can't possibly marry a Jewish woman because he's not Jewish, and he blurts out, well, actually, I am. And they give the address where they're living. So when it comes to it, the Gestapo know exactly where to find them. And find them they do. They are deported, both of them, first to Drancy, that notorious transit camp just outside Paris, and from there to Auschwitz. And as far as we know, or at least the likelihood is that Charlotte Salomon, age 26 and several months pregnant, was murdered on arrival. But miraculously, and it is, you know, it is an extraordinary story, she had the prescience to wrap up this extraordinary work of hers in brown paper, saying this is the property of Ottilie Moore, the American woman, who'd already gone back, in fact, by that point to the States, but felt it might help save the work. And she handed it to a local doctor, Dr. Moridis, who was actually an active member of the French resistance. And she said, again, very memorably, take it. C'est toute ma vie. It's all my life. In every sense, it was all her life. And extraordinarily, he survived the war. The work survived the war. Ottilie Moore comes back from America in 1946, and she's handed this parcel addressed to her. She, of course, is absolutely astounded at what she finds in it. And in 1947, Charlotte's parents, who have survived the war, they went to Amsterdam, they were in Westerbork, but they managed to escape, and they do live post-war lives in Amsterdam. They come back, well, they come to the south of France to try and find out what had happened to Charlotte. They find out, but they discover, you know, well, the tragedy, but also the miraculous survival of this extraordinary work. The family held on to it for about 10 years. They clearly did not know what to do with it. And it was only in the early 1960s that the first exhibition took place, which posited her very much as another Anne Frank. And incidentally, Anne Frank's father was a close friend of theirs in Amsterdam. The first book came in 1963, and it was in 1972 that the whole body of work, except for those revelatory pages that I've already referred to, was actually donated to the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam, where it is now housed to this very day. And just very lastly, you can go and see where she lived, Wielandstrasse in Charlottenburg, nice area still today of Berlin. There has been for many years this plaque that you can see on the bottom left, but also a Stolperstein, as you can see on the right there. So how do we remember her? Not just with memorial plaques, but I think the true memorial is the fact that so many, and I haven't got time, you know, so many other artists, writers, musicians, dancers have created works that pay homage to her directly or indirectly, and to her extraordinary life's work. And as Rachel mentioned, by way of a coda, this new work, an animated film called Charlotte, is just, it's been released in the States, but it's coming to the UK for those of you listening to me from Britain. But I think, you know, I don't want to be tactless. I have watched it. It's important to watch, but I think there is much that can be said. And I think, Rachel, you're planning, aren't you, an event that will be an opportunity precisely to discuss the pitfalls, if you like, yes, but also the importance of other artists reacting to her amazing story. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Monica. We had, while you were speaking, there were so many comments already, and articles that had been written about with links, and reference to a 2011 theater production in Portland, Oregon, that might be online. So as you just mentioned, there's a lot of information out on her, and a lot of different creatives were and still are inspired by her work and by her life story also, which is doesn't, I mean, I feel this, she lived for 26 years, but I feel she packed in at least 3 lifetimes of experiences. Like every single thing that you just touched upon because of our restriction of time is like, you know, our life challenges that could, you know, require attention for the rest of the life in terms of you know, dealing with them. But we're opening now to questions. So yeah.
Great. Before we do that, can I just show people this slide as well? The top link is to the exhibition that I referred to earlier, which was so far the only and remarkable opportunity to see the work in its entirety, but there's a very good website that relates to it. And then actually there's a link on that website, but I've given it to you there. Perhaps we can send it to people, or possibly put it in the chat right now, but it is actually the entire digitized version, if you like, of the work, which is a wonderful resource. But there are many other excellent articles. As you say, I can't see them, but you know, people are clearly aware of some of them. There's a very intelligent article in the New Yorker when these revelations of the possible murder came out, which I find is a very kind of balanced view of the whole difficult, you know, conundrum. Yeah.
And actually, we will send out links to all these places, also to your remarkable work, with a follow-up email. So it will be all in there. So just for people to know that you don't have to copy copy the address now. Yeah, there's a lot of questions about the availability of this event, this lecture, afterwards. So yes, it will be uploaded on YouTube, and we'll send out the links. Yeah, so, you know, as we're waiting for questions to come in, you know, I feel like I mean, one of the things that I found so very engaging and fascinating is these multidisciplinary approaches that she combines images and these very passionate images with her texts and with music. So she has, I feel like, none of the mediums were sufficient for her to express the complexity of her thoughts. Do you want to?
No, I absolutely agree. And I use the term Gesamtkunstwerk, which perhaps goes some way to you know, kind of alluding to that. One rather trendy, if I can use that word, way of regarding this work of late is as a kind of pioneering graphic novel, which again, I mean, there's some validity in that, and yet it's not the whole story. As you say, it's not just word and text by any means. And I do just reiterate, I think it's actually impossible to categorize. It is very much a one-off, and just because of that, perhaps people are constantly trying to pigeonhole it. We haven't talked about cinema, but you know, there are certain shots, as it were. They're not shots, they're painted gouache images, which are quite clearly derived from expressionist German cinema, for example. The range of musical references are to kind of, you know, Beethoven at one end, but also to, there's the Horst Wessel song at the other, but also popular cabaret songs of the day. So the range is absolutely amazing. It really is quite extraordinary. And she was so young. She was so young.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, remembering the image that you showed and discussed also in your talk about, the celebrations of Hitler's takeover in January 33, the text that accompanied this image criticized rather, in my understanding, criticized rather the Jews marching with everybody else, because everybody else was marching. We know that, but she, if I understood right, she criticized the Jews. So she had her, I feel a lot in these texts, she had comments or directed the perception of the images into criticism towards the German Jewish community.
Absolutely, and that muddies the waters, I think, quite a lot for anybody who kind of wants to see her some sort of Holocaust heroine. She clearly has, and this is the one I think you were referring to, yes?
Yes.
Just at the time, too many, yeah, it's very uncomfortable, isn't it? A sort of sense of profound ambivalence about her own position as a German Jewish woman, as I said, and I think gender also comes into it, but it's very disconcerting.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, and this is not the only time this occurs, this sort of sense of looking on in a uncomfortably detached way, and trying to understand perhaps why Germans, as it were, might indeed have perceived the Jews as a easy target. Yeah.
And it's quite interesting, this contradiction between these somehow these colors that appear to be emotionally loaded, and then the distance that she creates to her own character, making herself the observer of what was happening. So we have here a question about her education, which is maybe
go ahead, yeah,
important to answer.
Oh, is it a specific question, or shall I just tell you a little more?
Yes.
Okay, so she went to, I can even give you the exact, she was a pupil from 1927 onwards at the Fürstin Bismarck Gymnasium, which is now called Sophie Charlotte Gymnasium, possibly, I'm not sure about this, in homage to her, in Siebelstrasse in Charlottenburg, as in this very bourgeois, comfortable, still today, quarter of Berlin. And as I think I mentioned, she leaves school. It was a relatively moderate school, but then of course, as things get harder and harder, it becomes harder and harder for a Jewish girl to remain a pupil there. So she leaves at the age of 16. And I think I did mention this, she actually starts getting private tuition at home and some training, or the sort of hope is that she might become a fashion designer, but she then, without the knowledge of her parents, applies to the Fine Arts Academy in Berlin, which is where she really wants to be. Yes, and she's there from, I can give you the exact dates more or less. Where are we? Yes, she's there from 1935 to 36, first on approval as a Jewish woman, and then a little bit later unconditionally. But then again, things get harder and harder. And in 1938, her enrollment is annulled, and she has quite a benevolent and sort of as far as you can be, anti-fascist professor, who actually allows her, at least for a while, to use the studios at night when nobody else is there.
Mm-hmm.
She's awarded a prize apparently, but she can't go up and collect it because she's Jewish. Okay, and so it is, and essentially then comes Kristallnacht, and she leaves. So it's a broken history, but a real story of determination to make the most of whatever education she can lay her hands on. I think one thing that's actually very interesting, that although, as I'm sure you all know, entartete Kunst, avant-garde art, was entirely condemned by the Nazis, apparently the academy's library was left untouched, which meant that against all the odds, really, she had access to books about modern art, which I do feel, looking at the work, must have played in perhaps to her very rich visual vocabulary as an artist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. There's another question. Do you think she saw the work of Chagall or Matisse?
Yes, almost certainly. I think in a way, that last comment I've made.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I think one needs to be aware that although neither of her parents were artists, they mixed in a very, very cultured and creative milieu. So particularly when Paula, the stepmother, comes on the scene, there had Erich Mendelssohn, for example, the architect, was a close friend, Albert Einstein, Albert Schweitzer. Yeah, so although again, these are not visual artists, it gives you a sort of sense of the kind of cultured milieu in which she would have felt at ease, and I think would have had access to first-hand experience, you know, and certainly reproductions of works of artists like the ones just mentioned.
Right. And referring to this image, actually, Griselda says that Astrid Schmetterling has written about the assimilated German Jewish world in Life or Theater, but this image of the January 30th is ironic. She's not criticizing the Jews so much as anti-Semitic slurs. And so, and
I think it's both. I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean, I think, you know, one thing I haven't perhaps made clear enough is that she speaks with so many different voices in this work. So I think it could be construed, I mean, Griselda, of course, you're absolutely right. It is deeply ironic, and sardonic is another term I've used. But, you know, going back, for example, to that other image, the one of the Jewish figures around the table trying to decide where to go. Where is it? It's just coming up. This one here. There is a slightly caricatural element here, isn't there? Which again, I think suggests that there is a kind of unease or ambivalence about her own position within all this. So I think it's intensely complex.
Yeah. And actually, David says that her visual commentary on German Jewish life reminds him of Amos Elon's "The Pity of It All."
Oh, interesting.
That there's this certain German Jewish sarcasm in her work, which those who know it recognize it. And then, of course, there are a lot of questions and comments about the sexual abuse and with and making the Griselda makes the parallel to Anne Frank's diary, and where her father also suppressed a lot of the very explicit sexual comments, and that I feel it. The same happened with Charlotte's work, and especially with her murder of her grandfather, which I think if that information would have been released early on, it would have created a very different image of
absolutely
who she was as an artist and as a person.
And as a victim,
yes.
Absolutely. No, indeed. I think it's understandable, but actually now it's really important to take stock as dispassionately as possible, but without necessarily pronouncing judgment. It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. I mean, my own feeling is that, I mean, if I, again, just go, it's one of the wonders of PowerPoint is that you can flick so easily between images. But if you think that actually the so-called confessional letter, which is many pages long, which was apparently edited out, from public, from public awareness and sort of knowledge of the work, and it was given to the museum in Amsterdam, was written in this kind of script as a painted letter. I just wonder, I'm deeply unsure what to make of all this, as you can probably hear from my voice, but would you not, if you were actually confessing to a real life murder, would you do it in this public sort of way? And if you were writing to your erstwhile lover, would you not actually just write a letter, but to actually paint it? Do you understand what I'm getting at? As part of this fictive autobiography, I think actually complicates the issue quite considerably.
Yeah,
very difficult. Yeah,
very true. And Marcy says, thanks you for the powerful presentation, and also says, from everything we know and keep learning about Charlotte and her life, it appears very likely that her grandfather attempted to rape her on numerous occasions, and perhaps he even succeeded. And she says our view of sexual violence is always evolving, and in our contemporary context of women's self-defense, agency, and dignity, we can support Charlotte's actions towards him. So in a way, that makes the timing of the appearance of this letter much more favorable in a way than it would have been
absolutely.
in the 70s.
had it been divulged early on, it would have caused very, very different kinds of after effects, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. So first of all, there was a question. I believe those were all gouaches, right?
Yes.
And the question Jonathan is asking where the missing or redacted pages are. Are they all in the collection of the museum in Amsterdam?
Absolutely. As I said, it's well over 1,300. All wrapped together. So quite clearly, again, she attached importance to the ones she'd edited out. She didn't want them destroyed. Right. And one thing I didn't mention, actually, and I haven't actually got an image to show you, but you take my word for it, that actually, again, very disconcertingly, what she did in some cases to the rejected pages, she actually used like sort of masking tape and actually kind of crossed out the image with masking tape, a kind of act of physical violence on the images, which is also very, it's extraordinary, isn't it? But yes, the museum in Amsterdam, of course, can't exhibit it in its entirety, except for very rarely on this one occasion I mentioned. And I have to say, actually, when I first encountered the work, they were actually representing her only with very few images in facsimile, not even in the originals. And I think one of the things that has come with this increasing, if you like, art world and also popular celebration of the complexity and importance of her work is that the museum itself has come to attach more and more artistic value to it. And I think that is a good thing.
Yeah, and in terms of the artistic value, and I think we unfortunately have to close this event. Then I think the artistic value is very, there is this desire to categorize it, and she seems to evade all categories other than maybe the Gesamtkunstwerk that you mentioned, which also quite doesn't quite fit. No. So, which kind of puts her completely out of the larger canon and puts her into a very unique position as an artist, and I think that has many levels still of discovery, and probably any decision for just one of the channels, whether it's the theater, whether it's the presentation of the paintings, whether it's the concentration on the works, it all reduces what she created in a way. And so probably by presenting her work, you kind of have to focus, mention on this multidimensional experience, but at the same time, you have to kind of deduct to make it, understandable, or to get some kind of understanding of the opus that she created here.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think, the very impossibility of pinning her down, of categorizing her, as you say, the dangers of oversimplification or distortion in so doing, is partly the reason why people continue to be fascinated by her, that, she has given risen, or her work has given risen to so many more recent creative, experiments in so many different media. And it's very much ongoing, as the new film testifies.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Monica. This was such an enriching, inspiring, and intense hour that we just spent together. And I know that there are many questions still open, and I apologize for those that I did not pick. But I hope we can find a way to continue that conversation. And of course, the lecture will be uploaded, and you will all receive that information in our follow-up email. Thank you so much for being with us today, and stay tuned for the next Charlotte event, and for our next for the next Fritz Ascher Society events. And be well, and I hope to see you soon. Goodbye. Thank you, Monica. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. All the best.
Thank you. All the best.